They thought pushing around an old war hero would be easy, until they realized someone far more dangerous was watching. When a group of arrogant rich kids decided to humiliate a 90-year-old veteran, they expected no resistance. But what they didn't know? A shadow was watching from a distance, and that shadow was Rambo. Clearwater, a small town tucked away in the Midwest, was the kind of place where life moved at its own slow, steady pace. The buildings were old, the streets lined with mom-and-pop shops, and the heart of the town was a quaint little square where people gathered for coffee and conversation. The world outside may have changed, but Clearwater had remained untouched, a relic of a time when neighbors still knew and looked out for one another. Sitting on an old wooden bench in the middle of the town square was Colonel Henry Walker, a 90-year-old war veteran whose presence alone carried the weight of history. Dressed in a worn but neatly pressed military jacket, Henry fed the pigeons every afternoon, his gnarled hands scattering seeds onto the cobblestone path. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, followed the world with quiet observation. He wasn't just another old man. He was a man who had fought, bled, and survived for something greater than himself. Though he rarely spoke of his past, the town respected him deeply. They knew he had fought in Vietnam, had lost friends on the battlefield, and had carried that burden every day since. And though his body had grown frail, his spirit remained unbroken. But on this day, the peace that had always surrounded Henry was about to be shattered. The low rumble of an expensive sports car echoed through the otherwise quiet square, breaking the town's usual calm. The sound alone was enough to turn heads. Clearwater wasn't the kind of place where people drove around in six-figure vehicles. It was a town of old trucks and rusted sedans, a place where wealth wasn't measured in money, but in community and loyalty. The car, a sleek, black Lamborghini, pulled up right in front of the square's fountain, parking illegally as if rules didn't apply to it. The doors swung open, and three men in their late 20s stepped out, dressed in designer clothes that screamed privilege and entitlement. At the front of the group was Tanner Whitmore, the son of a real estate mogul who had bought up half the land in town, turning it into overpriced developments that no locals could afford. Tanner wasn't from Clearwater. He had grown up in mansions, spent summers in the Hamptons, and never had to work a real day in his life. His money had shielded him from consequences, his arrogance fueled by the knowledge that no matter what he did, his father's money would clean it up. The two men with him, Justin and Cole, both the sons of wealthy investors, were just as bad. They laughed loudly, their voices carrying across the square, not caring who heard them. As they stepped forward, Tanner's eyes landed on Henry, still sitting on the bench, feeding the pigeons like he did every day. But today, he was about to become their entertainment. Tanner smirked, nudging Justin. "Check it out. Old war fossil still thinks he's relevant." The comment sent a chill through the air, but Henry didn't react. He had heard worse in his lifetime. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't going to stop at just words. Tanner strode forward, his designer loafers clicking against the pavement, his posture dripping with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Justin and Cole flanked him, grinning as if they were about to pull some harmless prank. But the glint in Tanner's eyes told a different story. Henry continued to toss breadcrumbs, seemingly unbothered by their presence. But his grip on the brown paper bag had tightened just slightly. He knew their kind. He had met their type on the battlefield, not in uniform, but in attitude. Men who thought power came from privilege. Men who had never known what it was like to be small. Tanner stopped right in front of him, tilting his head as if examining some ancient relic. "Tell me, old man," he said, voice dripping with mockery. Do you actually think you did anything worthwhile back then? Henry finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Tanner's. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. That silence? It was something Tanner wasn't used to. See, I think guys like you, Tanner continued, gesturing lazily, you fight your little wars, come home expecting respect. And then, what? You sit here feeding birds while the world moves on without you? Cole chuckled. Justin leaned in with a smirk. We're just saying, Grandpa. You could have done something useful instead of wasting your life playing soldier. The disrespect in their tone was deliberate, a calculated move to provoke. Henry slowly set the bag of breadcrumbs down beside him. His back straightened just slightly. The movement was subtle, but to a trained eye, it was a shift in posture that meant something. A warning. And from across the square, someone noticed. From a shaded spot near the edge of the park, Rambo had been watching. He had been sitting on a weathered wooden bench, arms crossed over his broad chest, eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. He hadn't planned on staying long, just passing through, keeping to himself, as he always did. But then he had noticed the way the three young men moved. Rambo didn't just see people, he read them, their posture, their intent, the way they walked like they owned the ground beneath them. Predators. He recognized them immediately for what they were. Not real fighters, not men who had ever been tested, but opportunists. Men who only fought battles they knew they could win. And now they had made a mistake. They had chosen the wrong battlefield. From his bench, Rambo leaned forward just slightly. He didn't stand yet. He just watched. Calculated. Measured the distance, the angle. The old man hadn't moved yet, but Rambo knew that posture. That was a man who wasn't about to go down without a fight. Still, Henry was outnumbered. Rambo's jaw tightened. He had promised himself no more fights, no more stepping in. But then Tanner did something that made the decision for him. He reached out and shoved Henry's shoulder. Hard. Henry stumbled back slightly, catching himself with his cane. The air shifted, and that was when Rambo stood. Rambo moved without hesitation. His boots barely made a sound as he crossed the grass, his presence unnoticed. Until it wasn't. Tanner had turned back toward his friends, laughing, mocking the old man. Then he froze. A shadow loomed over him. A presence. Slowly, Tanner turned his head, and the smirk that had been so easy, so confident, evaporated the second he locked eyes with Rambo. The two other men, Carter and Brent, noticed the shift too. Carter's expression darkened, his arrogant sneer wavering. Brent, always the follower, took a half-step backward, as if his instincts had just warned him of the very real danger standing before them. And Rambo? He said nothing. For a long, agonizing moment, he simply stood there. His cold, unreadable gaze bore into Tanner like a blade, stripping away every ounce of the confidence that money and privilege had ever given him. Henry, still gripping his cane, slowly turned his head to see what had changed. When he recognized the figure standing beside him, he let out a breath. He knew that stance, that presence, that absolute, unwavering stillness. A warrior was here. The young men were used to being the ones who made the rules. They were used to laughing off threats, brushing aside consequences. But something in Rambo's eyes told them. This was different. Tanner forced a smirk back onto his face, but it was weaker now. "Who the hell are you?" he scoffed. Rambo still didn't answer. His silence was its own message. Carter, always eager to assert dominance, took a step forward. "This isn't your business, old man," he sneered. "Walk away." Still, no reaction. Rambo merely tilted his head slightly, as if assessing them. His gaze flickered from Tanner to Carter to Brent, calculating their weaknesses, their level of fight or flight. He had seen men like them before, too many times, and he already knew how this was going to end. Tanner, clearly unnerved by the lack of response, pushed forward. "What? Are you some kind of tough guy?" His voice wavered slightly. "You got a problem, old man?" Rambo finally spoke. His voice was low, steady. "You need to leave." Tanner scoffed, but the flicker of fear in his eyes betrayed him. "And if I don't?" Rambo took a slow, measured step forward, and Tanner instinctively stepped back. The moment was so small, so subtle, but Carter saw it. Brent saw it. Rambo didn't have to say another word. He wasn't threatening them. He wasn't warning them. He was giving them a choice, the last one they'd get. The silence stretched, suffocating. And then Tanner broke. He scoffed, shaking his head as if to dismiss the tension. "Whatever, man. Not worth it." He turned on his heel, storming back toward the luxury car parked on the street. Carter hesitated, but Brent had already started moving. "You got lucky, old man," Carter muttered toward Henry, though the words lacked conviction. Then they were gone. The car roared to life, and within moments, the three of them had sped off, their bravado fleeing with them. Rambo watched until the car disappeared from sight. Then, finally, he exhaled. Henry chuckled softly beside him. "I had it handled," he muttered, though there was no argument in his tone. Rambo turned his gaze toward him, studying the deep lines on his face, the battle-worn eyes of a man who had fought his own wars. "I know," Rambo said, and he meant it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, the distant chatter of the park-goers returning as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Henry exhaled, adjusting his grip on his cane as he looked over at Rambo. "That was a different kind of fight," he murmured. Rambo gave a small nod. "Some men fight with fists. Some fight with power. Those boys? They think their money makes them untouchable." Henry smirked, rubbing the back of his hand. "Guess they found out the hard way." The old veteran slowly turned, lowering himself onto the bench with a tired grunt. Rambo remained standing for a moment before finally easing down beside him. "Used to be," Henry said after a beat. "When a man had a problem with you, he looked you in the eye and settled it himself. Now? Now they hide behind lawyers, behind cameras, behind daddy's money." Rambo didn't respond, but the truth of Henry's words settled between them. Henry tapped his cane against the pavement. "You ever see combat?" Rambo let out a quiet breath. "Yeah." Henry studied him for a second, nodding knowingly. "Thought so. You move like a soldier." Rambo remained still, staring ahead at the trees swaying gently in the wind. "You know what I miss?" Henry mused. "I miss when men looked out for each other, when you knew your neighbor had your back. Now? Now people see something wrong. They take out their phones instead of stepping in." Rambo's jaw tightened. Henry shook his head. "People say the world is safer now, but it doesn't feel safer, does it?" Rambo finally spoke, his voice quiet. "No." Henry sighed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The two sat there in silence, just two old warriors in a world that had long since moved on. But some battles never truly ended, and some men never stopped fighting. Across the park, life carried on as if nothing had happened. Parents pushed strollers, joggers passed by with headphones in, and groups of teenagers sat on benches scrolling through their phones. No one knew or cared about the fight that had just unfolded. For Henry, that was just how life worked. You fought your battles, and the world kept moving. He tapped his cane against the pavement again, watching as a young couple walked by, completely oblivious. "I fought for a world where people wouldn't have to worry about things like this," he muttered. "Funny how things turned out." Rambo turned his head slightly, watching him. Henry let out a dry chuckle. "I don't expect the world to be perfect. Never have. But I do expect a little damn respect. You give people respect, and they give it back. But those boys—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Rambo leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Respect isn't taught in their world. It's bought." Henry smirked. "Yeah, and when they can't buy it, they get desperate." A silence stretched between them again, not awkward, but weighted with meaning. Finally, Henry sighed, straightening his back. "Well, I suppose I should thank you," he said. "Not many men step in when trouble comes knocking." Rambo didn't respond immediately. He simply glanced over at the old veteran, reading between the lines of what he wasn't saying. Finally, Rambo shrugged. "Some fights are still worth fighting." Henry let out a quiet chuckle. "Guess that makes two of us." They sat there a little longer, watching as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the park. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees, carrying with it a crispness that hinted at the coming evening. Finally, Henry pushed himself up with his cane, his old bones protesting the movement. "I should head home before it gets dark." Rambo gave him a nod, standing up alongside him. "Need a ride?" Henry smiled. "Nah, I'll manage. Not my first long walk home." Rambo nodded again, and for the first time, a faint smirk ghosted across his face. Henry took a step, then paused, glancing over his shoulder. "If you're ever in town again, you ought to stop by the VFW. They'd like you." Rambo didn't say anything at first. He simply held Henry's gaze for a long moment before giving the smallest of nods. "Maybe." Henry chuckled, tipping an imaginary hat before turning toward the street, his cane tapping against the pavement as he walked. Rambo watched him go. The world would keep moving. People would forget what happened today. But Henry would remember. And Rambo? He would always be watching. Because some men never stop being soldiers, and some fights are never truly over.